Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. In an interview last week to Brian Kilmeade of Fox & Friends, US Secretary of State Michael Pompeo came up with two strange observations with reference to Pakistan. One relates to, and I quote, harboring terrorists, and the other referred to nuclear proliferation. The first observation comes after a string of questions where Kilmeade is talking about talks with the Taliban in Doha and refers to Pakistan saying, you know that Pakistan is the problem. You know they are training, arming, and equipping, and without them, the Taliban are vapor. How much longer are we going to put up with this? This prompts Pompeo to say this.
Taking actions against Pakistan that no other administration has taken. I do see this. I see this from, I've had friends killed. You have too, I'm sure. Lots of New Yorkers were killed when those towers came down. I've not forgotten the lesson from 9/11. We need Pakistan to do more. They have to stop harboring these terrorists. We saw what happened with India, the conflict that rose there as a result of terrorists that departed from Pakistan. We need the Pakistanis to step up. They need to stop harboring terrorists.
Towards the later half of the interview, Kilmeade wants to know if global warming is a threat. And this is how he questions. Everyone's talking about global warming and the threat to this country. When you look at the top 5 threats to this nation, where do you rank global warming or climate change? And Secretary Pompeo says, yeah, I won't put it in the top 5. And then he questions why. And he says, because I can count to 5 that get you to things that present more risk to the people, whether it's the threat that we have talked about today from China, the nuclear proliferation risk that extends from Pakistan, through all those folks who have these weapon systems, places like North Korea where they can sell these weapons. I think I am at 5 already. But I could give you a whole list of threats that I think we can effect change on in a way that will really make a difference for the security of the American people. Now, Brian Kilmeade is not exactly someone that one would expect to either know or appreciate nuance. But Pompeo holds a high and sensitive office. Why did he make such loose talk? To discuss this and the repercussions of those words, because language is very important. We have David Sedney, who's a senior associate at CSIS, but has also been Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and also for Afghanistan and Pakistan on 2 separate tenures. Dr. Rifaat Hussain, who is Head of Department, Government and Public Policy at NUST. Ali Sultan, who is an expert in international law. And Ambassador Zamir Akram, who also joins us from Islamabad. David, it's kind of, I was reading the transcript of the interview, which is on the State Department website. And it seems to me that Secretary Pompeo is also speaking in a sort of stream of consciousness fashion. Of course, Kilmeade's questions move from one to another, and he's all over the place. But so is Secretary Pompeo. Now, from this entire thing about talks with the Taliban in Doha and the question about Pakistan, to suddenly a jump towards what happened in Indian-occupied Kashmir, and then the Indian aggression against Pakistan. However, no mention of that, but as a matter of fact, blaming Pakistan for having been complicit, of which there is zero evidence. What's going on here?
Well, I have to take issue with some of what you said, because I think it is quite clear that Pakistan has supported terrorist groups that take action in Kashmir, and the fact that Pakistan continues to allow those who are on international terrorist list, including on the US terrorist list, to act openly in Pakistan, to give speeches, to raise money, to support the actions that occurred in Kashmir. In terms of actual knowledge of what happened on the ground there, I would have to defer to Secretary Pompeo. He would have more access to intelligence information than I would. But in terms of the broad picture that Pakistan continues to support, allow to operate on its territory, those who raise money, those who advocate attacks in Kashmir, those who are on the US terrorist list, and allow those people, and we all know who they are, we could all name them, to act with impunity on the soil of Pakistan, is clear evidence that Pakistan continues to support terrorism.
Okay, Ali Sultan, I need to pull you in on this. So people who are operating in Indian-occupied Kashmir over the last 5-6 years, who are indigenous Kashmiris, according to India's own statistics. Some of them are civilian protesters, others are, have picked up guns. Are they terrorists? Because language, as I said, is very important. Words are extremely significant. Taxonomy is very important because quite apart from this post-9/11 effort by states to conflate terrorism with freedom struggles is something that requires a pushback. So give me a sense of what international law says here.
Thank you first for having me, Ejaz. Well, as you said, taxonomy is extremely important. And also, we have to keep in mind what is the current state of international law on this, especially how it has developed in the aftermath of 9/11, where, as you just pointed out, states have tried to vitiate or dissolve this distinction between legitimate freedom fighting, which arguably had space under several United Nations General Assembly resolutions, dating back to the 1970s. But post 9/11, violence, political violence in any form, for instance, and India has been at the forefront of pushing this argument that political violence of any form, whether even if it is for self-determination, should be treated as terrorism. And they've been able to form consensus around this, at least with sort of key states, including the United States, on this. So if we want to sort of push back on this, then we will have to portray the conflict in Kashmir as an occupation by India. That's the first challenge, because then the Geneva Conventions framework starts to apply. And then under the Geneva Conventions, these acts would arguably be legitimate because the target in Pulwama, for instance, was not a civilian target, it was a military target. And as you said, Kashmir has been simmering for the last 2 years, ever since the death of Burhan Wani, and so on and so forth. And even Adil Dar was in the custody of Indian forces. And what really motivated him to engage in this act was the treatment that was meted out to him by the Indian forces, rather than being ideologically indoctrinated by Jaish-e-Mohammed, because cross-border infiltration, as India also has admitted many times now, is virtually impossible. So,
let me go back to David Sedney here. David, what do you say about the UN General Assembly resolutions? They're still very much there in terms of the right for freedom struggles, armed resistance, political violence, and also, in fact, specifically one UNGA resolution that also allows people to ask for external help. All of that is right there. So I think perhaps we need to be a little more subtle about these things rather than weighing in on one particular side.
I think it's actually more simple than you presented. Mm-hmm. The groups, the individuals, Jaish-e-Mohammed and other groups that are operating on Pakistani soil, that are raising money and are carrying out terrorist attacks against civilians. That is something that is recognized by the rest of the world. A number of these groups and individuals have been sanctioned.
Jaish-e-Mohammed is also a proscribed organization in Pakistan. Jaish-e-Mohammed was responsible for targeting not once but more than once former President Pervez Musharraf. Jaish-e-Mohammed has also been involved in other terrorist activities, attacking civilian soft targets inside Pakistan. And that is also true of other terrorist groups that have been designated as proscribed organizations within Pakistan, and that includes the TTP, the Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, and various others.
But there are individuals, as I think we all know, who have been sanctioned under U.S. law and under international sanctions through the UN that are still active in Pakistan despite those sanctions.
But David, here's another thing. You do know that this 1267 thing has been criticized by lawyers because it does not allow a due process to the person, to the individual who's being sanctioned. And I think that flies in the face of basic legal remedies available that should be available, that are available under domestic laws to everyone. Now, that is one thing. Secondly, when this was done, for instance, to Hafiz Saeed way back, he had actually applied to the UN Security Council saying that I want to make a presentation and challenge this, my name being placed on the sanctions list. Of course, that didn't go anywhere because individuals do not have the right to actually approach the United Nations like that. But the fact is that 1267 is a very problematic area.
Well, we will have to agree that we disagree on that. I believe 1267 has been a fairly effective way of going after those who advocate for support through monetary means, through raising weapons and other activities in support of terrorism. That, I think, is broadly speaking, in the 1267 regime, been a very positive mechanism.
Okay, would you agree that there should also be a mechanism within 1267 which allows, if someone's name has been placed on the sanction list, and if that person wants to approach the United Nations and say, well, you guys have put me on this list and I challenge that, shouldn't there be a legal provision for that person to actually challenge it and get due process?
There is a process for states removing people from the 1267 list. It is something that is done by states. There have been individuals who have been removed from that list through that process. So there is a process for removal. It is not something that is done by
still involves the state. That's the problem. That's the problem. But hold on, David. I'll come back to you. Let me go across to Dr. Rifaat Hussain in Islamabad. Dr. Hussain, what do you make of the conversation we have had so far?
Well, Ejaz, the critical issue here is the one of evidence. And in this case, particularly in the case of Pulwama, there is no evidence, hard evidence I'm talking about, which establishes a direct connection between the individual who committed this act of suicide against a military target, as was pointed out by Ali. And there is a presumption that Jaish-e-Mohammed, even though they took credit for it, but there is no hard evidence that would suggest that Adil Dar was a card-carrying member of Jaish-e-Mohammed. So, which means that in this case, at least we have very such evidence, and there is no evidence that establishes a direct connection between Adil Dar and Jaish-e-Mohammed. That's one. The second thing is that, as you mentioned, that Pakistan has no benefit to gain from allowing Jaish-e-Mohammed to continue to operate in Pakistan, because they not only have attacked the President of Pakistan, former President Musharraf, but they have been involved in several attacks, including the attack on Sri Lankan cricket team, including the attack on GHQ, and they have carried out several attacks against the Hazara community inside Balochistan. So unless one believes that Pakistan is an accomplice in encouraging a group to attack its own citizens, it's hard to believe that right now, yes, you may say that Jaish-e-Mohammed, on whose behalf it's operating. Jaish-e-Mohammed, Maulana Masood Azhar, before he was released as part of the deal, hijacking deal, he had spent 4 years inside the Indian jail, and he was interned by the Indians. So there are a lot of people who are questioning about the credibility of Jaish-e-Mohammed, and they are arguing that Jaish-e-Mohammed could very well be a double agent. So precisely for that reason, I think Pakistan needs to look at the case against him, and and move against him.
Okay, Ambassador Zamir Akram, one point that I raised during the introduction, which I think bears repeating because it seems to have got lost in the discussion so far, which is that Kilmeade's questions were with reference to Taliban and US talks in Doha. And then he keeps talking about, how can you be in the same room with the bad guys and the rest of it, and then goes on to start talking about Pakistan. And from there, Secretary Pompeo takes a leap of imagination and starts talking about what happened in occupied Kashmir and then the Indian response. So I think there's a bit of the looseness here that I was talking about. What would you say to that?
Well, Ejaz, I think the real issue is that the US sees India as a strategic ally against China, and that's driving this entire relationship. And this conversation on television by Secretary Pompeo is in line with that approach towards India. Let's deal with the facts. As Rifaat pointed out, the evidence. I have talked to people who have seen this so-called dossier given to us by the Indians after Pulwama. And this consists just an exchange of emails and claims and allegations without any hard evidence linking the Jaish leadership in Pakistan to the attacker in Pulwama. So I don't see any link that has been established here. The fact also remains that the Kashmiris have been engaged in a struggle for their right of self-determination, which, as was pointed out by the international law expert, is an internationally recognized dispute and an occupied territory, and in which, according to the UN resolutions, international law, the Kashmiris have a right to struggle for, and theirs is a legitimate struggle. So it cannot be compared with terrorism. Our fault has been that since President Musharraf's time, we did not make that distinction as effectively as we should have. But I think that now, with this incident and with the demonstration that the Kashmiris have shown, and the determination that the Kashmiris have shown to resist Indian occupation, we have to make this clear distinction. Even the New York Times, in its editorial last week, admitted that the problem in this entire region is the dispute over Kashmir. And until this dispute is resolved, and until and unless the Indians end their repression against the Kashmiris, this kind of incidents can recur at any time. Now, President Trump talked about good news coming from this region, but a few days before that, his national security advisor and the State Department both made statements that actually encouraged the Indians to launch their offensive against Pakistan. So I would put part of the blame on them, on the United States, for encouraging this kind of action. It was only after Pakistan responded and demonstrated that it has the capability and the willingness to respond to India militarily that the Americans decided that India should now undertake de-escalation. So I think the whole issue needs to be seen from the context of the Indo-US relationship, which is giving a completely skewed view of what the ground realities are in Kashmir.
Okay. David, is there a very determined kind of strategic dimension now to the US-India relationship? One that would perhaps preclude the US dealing with Pakistan in any meaningful or positive way? I mean, I'm not really into determinism, but I just want to know.
No, I don't think so at all. The US is a major power. India is a major power. And you raised the issue of China. The Ambassador Zamir Akram raised the issue of China, which is very much a rising and important concern of both the US and India. So the US and India do have concerns about China. Mm-hmm. But I think the old idea that India-Pakistan relations have to be the fulcrum of all US relations with India is no longer the case. In the US, we have moved to, and I think successfully, de-link that India-Pakistan link. Yes, India and Pakistan have issues, but India as a world major power, has a role to play regarding China and any other major world issue. So I think it's a complicated relationship, but it's not one that's determined anymore by the India-Pakistan nexus.
Okay, Sedney, I want to take you back to what I earlier said about the context in which Brian Kilmeade was questioning Pompeo, and then how it kind of spun out of control. So just to give you a bit of context here, Brian was essentially talking about, these bad guys, the Gitmo guys who were gotten out of Gitmo by the previous administration. They're also showing up for these talks in Doha. And Pompeo says, Brian, I don't want to answer who has been showing up there. I will say this. And then he pushes and he says, is that acceptable if they are? And Pompeo says, I'll say this, we have negotiated with some really bad people. I was in Hanoi talking to a regime that has caused enormous harm to its own people. The State Department doesn't often get to choose exactly who it is. We're trying to achieve good security outcomes for the American people. Sometimes we end up talking to some really bad folks. And then, Brian says, and that would be okay to stay in that room with, as far as you're concerned. And Pompeo says, if we can deliver security for the American people, we'll talk to just about anyone, which makes perfect sense to me from a realist perspective. And then, of course, Brian gets into this whole Pakistan thing. And Pompeo, instead of focusing on the issue of Taliban talks in Doha and the fact that Pakistan, and that's something that's been acknowledged at the highest levels of the American officialdom, that Pakistan is facilitating these talks, instead of sticking to that, remaining within the framework, Pompeo chooses to just kind of start talking about things that really weren't part of the questioning process. Don't you think, coming from the US Secretary of State, who's the topmost diplomat, that's a bit of, there's a bit of the brazen in there, or some kind of, faux pas?
Not at all. I would say that Secretary Pompeo is the Secretary of State of the United States, which is a major world power.
That we know, which is why I'm surprised.
Is concerned about all aspects of Pakistani behavior. So it is perfectly consistent for the United States to thank Pakistan for any positive role it's played in the talks with the Taliban, while at the same time criticizing Pakistan for support from terrorism writ large, which does continue, as I mentioned before, continuing to allow organizations and individuals to operate in Pakistan, even though they are under both UN and, even more broadly, US sanctions. So there are individuals who are on the US sanctions list, which Pakistan has taken no action against and allows to operate freely in Pakistan. So Secretary Pompeo has a complex job. He has to work with Pakistan where he can, which he did, but he also has to be very clear about the U.S. interest, the importance the U.S. plays on Pakistan doing more on terrorism, which is exactly what he said. So I have to say I actually completely reject your characterization of Secretary Pompeo, and I think he is actually doing a very good job, and he's articulating American interests just as he should.
Okay. At this point, I have to take a break. At the other end of the break, we will continue talking about this and also bring in another aspect from Secretary Pompeo's interview, which referred to proliferation. And how did that come about? We'll discuss that after this break. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing last week's interview by Secretary Pompeo to Brian Kilmeade, who does Fox and Friends, and the couple of aspects of the interview where he spoke about Pakistan that we're discussing. Before I get to the proliferation part of it, Ali, and I think I'll pull in Ambassador Zamir Akram on that. Just give me a sense of, David is saying, I was trying to get him to focus on the context of the interview. But before the break, he said, well, Pompeo is the US Secretary of State, and he has to deal with multiple things. And so, he has to work with Pakistan as far as the talks with the Taliban are concerned, but he also has to chide Pakistan for what he said, quote unquote, harboring terrorist groups. Give me a sense of the law here. How does this work?
Okay, Ejaz, first of all, let me say a few words about 1267 and the listing process. And as you pointed out, and I agree with you, it has been severely criticized by several international lawyers precisely on the grounds that you raised, that there are human rights concerns here, due process concerns here, because the entities and the individuals who end up getting listed there have no process to challenge that listing directly. So that's a fundamental violation of due process. And there are decisions from the European Court of Human Rights, no less, which have overturned these listings in the past, and some national courts in Europe as well have done it. So to say that 1267 is an excellent mechanism, doesn't really make sense to me and to many international lawyers as well. And also, if it is such a comprehensive list to sort of tackle global terrorism, then why are we just restricting it to entities associated with Daesh as well as Al-Qaeda? So can we put certain white nationalist groups which have, quite frankly, manifestos which are very scary and which do skirt towards terrorism, what's sauce for the goose should be sauce for the gander too then. And how about RSS? Why can't we put RSS?
On RSS, absolutely.
Why can't we put RSS on 1267? So I mean,
day before, an Indian Special Anti-Terror Court has actually allowed 4 accused to walk free, who have already made confessions recorded by the Indian media on the issue of the Ajmer terrorist attack, the Samjhota terrorist attack,
the
Makkah terrorist attack. So I think there's need to absolutely, as you said, then perhaps we need to expand the list.
I mean, the mechanism should be fair. It should come across as fair, for it to appeal, to that. So that's what I would say. It's a very political. It's a very political concept, terrorism under international affairs. So to think of it in legal terms becomes difficult and complicated. So that's the current state of the law. And also, there really is no global consensus on a universal definition of terrorism. For many years, at the UN, there has been a convention, comprehensive convention against terrorism, which is being debated, but the world community has been unable to adopt it precisely because of this difference over the definition of terrorism. So that's the current state of the law.
Absolutely. Ambassador Zamir Akram, there's also this bit about the proliferation thing in Secretary Pompeo's interview, where he mentions Pakistan. Is this like what? It's like the old song, it's the AQ Khan aspect. What exactly is he talking about? What do you think?
I think that his comments were made in almost a flippant manner, non-serious, because Pakistan has been a nuclear weapon state since 1998. And Pakistan and the United States have engaged in strategic dialogue on issues relating to nuclear proliferation, arms control, disarmament, etc. since that time. And the US has stated time and again that it recognizes Pakistan as a nuclear weapon state. So to say now that there is proliferation from Pakistan, I fail to understand as to what kind of proliferation is he talking about. More importantly, if you look at the Trump administration's national security strategy, they mention, it mentions China and Russia and its nuclear arsenal, and also that of North Korea, as posing a threat to the United States. There is no mention in this document about Pakistan posing a threat of a nuclear proliferation nature to the United States. So I don't know where Mr. Pompeo has got it into his head And that's why I think that this is not a serious comment or not a well thought out comment on his part. But if you allow me, Ejaz, I also want to come back a bit to the issue of US-India relationship. The idea that the US is treating India as a major power in which Pakistan's role is not relevant, I think that is completely untrue. The fact remains that India and the United States are engaging in a relationship which the United States knows very well that will affect Pakistan. So you cannot divorce the ground realities and claim that the two are not related. India also, when we used to purchase weapons from the United States, India used to make it a point to ensure that these weapons, that the US would ensure that these weapons such as the F-16s would not be used against India. So there is this relationship. Beyond that, I think we need to recall how the US has given India a wide leverage, for instance, on its purchase of the S-400 missiles from Russia. And they have given them a waiver so that the Indians can go ahead with that purchase. Whereas Turkey, which did the same thing, is being denied certain new aircraft that they have purchasing. And similarly is the case about Indian purchase of Iranian oil. So there are obvious double standards here that we see are operating. And then I fully agree with what has been mentioned about the legal situation, about the legal criteria that the 1267 committee works under. I think this is a complete hypocrisy in the way they are interpreting the law and applying the law towards Pakistan or towards India for that matter. India, we know, as does the United States, that it is supporting the TTP from bases in Afghanistan that are conducting terrorist attacks in Pakistan. The US has done nothing about it. The Indians are known to be responsible for conducting that, for backing up the BLA attack on the Chinese consulate in Karachi. Again, nothing has happened about that from the United States. As well as the issue of Kulbhushan Yadav, whom is the case that we know all very well is before the International Court of Justice. The point is that there are double standards here, as I said, and we in Pakistan are also responsible for not arguing our case strongly. I've been saying this, writing about it, that we need to take a much stronger view and a much stronger position on these issues. Today the United States needs us because we are helping them get a face-saving withdrawal out of Afghanistan. This is an opportunity that we should use, at least to tell them that they need to close down these network of Indian-supported terrorists in Afghanistan. Okay. And they also need to change their narrative, the kind of narrative that Pompeo spews out unthinkingly and with the impact that the Indians also had, as I said earlier, in encouraging them to attack Pakistan and risking escalation on a nuclear escalation ladder.
Absolutely, that's a very important point. But let me go to Dr. Rifaat Hussain on this. Dr. Hussain, as a political scientist and also as a structural realist, you know, we can't say, well, there's realism involved here, but at the same time, there are double standards because there are always going to be double standards. And that's the kind of world that we have to deal with. And that's the kind of world where we have to strategize and also, you know, introduce and push our narrative. So I think perhaps we need to lament a little less and start becoming proactive a little more.
Well, most certainly, but being a structural realist does not mean that you ignore the moral or ethical dimensions of your foreign policy and international relations. For example, in case of Kashmir, let me point it out that, you know, it's a disputed territory, and India does not recognize even the disputed nature of this problem, which has been on the agenda of the United Nations since 1947. And ironically, India was the one who took it to the UN Security Council. So which means that, you know, the underlying assumption is that when they accuse Pakistan of promoting terrorism against against India, the acknowledgement thereof, they are recognizing or they are arguing that the Indian part of Kashmir, it belongs to India. No, it doesn't. So once you recognize the disputed nature of this problem, then the question becomes that, how do you deal with the Kashmiri freedom movement? Yes, in the past, Pakistan has supported the Kashmiris' right to self-defense militarily. But over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly the latest phase of the Kashmir dispute, where it has been established, and people like A.G. Noorani have mentioned this in their recent columns, that about 700 youth, Kashmiri youth, have joined the ranks of the militants. So I would say that, dismissing the entire movement as a terrorist movement and then acknowledging India's right of self-defense from the support that this movement gets from internationally and from across the border is really is not a tenable position.
Okay. David Sedney, I think you've accumulated lots of points from this discussion, but let me ask you, because you're part of the DoD and you dealt with the Pakistani military also. I'm sure you know the extensive cooperation as far as setting up safety and security procedures are concerned, the Strategic Plans Division, the National Command Authority, the personnel reliability programs, and the rest of it. So why do you think Secretary Pompeo would, as Ambassador Akram said, make a flippant, unthinking comment with reference to proliferation?
Well, first, Ejaz, while I very much appreciate being on the program, I feel it's sort of a 3-on-1, and I don't have the time, and you won't give me the time to respond to all of the comments, and I think some inaccurate comments that were made by the in earlier statements. But let me say very strongly that I disagree with the characterization of Secretary Pompeo's remarks as flippant or any of the other derogatory statements that have been made about him. I do need to go back to a statement that the ambassador made regarding U.S. and India relations. I did not say that we ignored Pakistan. The United States treats Pakistan as a sovereign, independent state, and we work with it. What I said is we don't have a posture where every issue is always linked to the India-Pakistan dynamic. Some issues are and some issues are not. India is a much bigger, more powerful country than Pakistan. That's just a fact. That doesn't mean we don't treat Pakistan seriously. It doesn't mean we don't treat other states that are smaller than India seriously. We do. But our relationship with India is broader than that with Pakistan, and it has aspects.
That's essentially what Ambassador Zamir Akram also said.
No, he said, and I quote, that the United States doesn't pay attention to Pakistan. That was wrong. We do pay attention to Pakistan.
Okay, go on.
Again, on the issue of on the nuclear issue, as you said, there are many areas where Pakistan, in recent years, has taken some very positive steps, and the United States, I'm sure, recognizes those areas, and especially in control of nuclear weapons and material. However, the fact is that the actions that took place in the past will always be a part of the present, and so that is an area where I think it is perfectly reasonable for Secretary Pompeo to make the comments that he did. In terms of the operation, you've had a lot of discussion, including international law discussion, about the UN resolution, about UN 1267 sanctions. As your guest has said, there have been criticisms of it. There are also international lawyers, I would say a preponderance of international lawyers, that are supportive of it. And I would think it would be a very good idea for you to have another international lawyer to present an international law case on the other side of that. It is not my area of specialty. I focus on the political side. And on that, I would have to say that the discussion about whether what happens in Kashmir is terrorism or freedom fighting is one on which there are two sides. And I know that your side, and I know that of your guest is one side, but there's another side as well. But I don't want to completely dominate the discussion, so I will turn it back over to you. But again, I have to say I reject the characterization of Secretary Pompeo's statements as flippant or any other kind of derogatory description of that. I think Secretary Pompeo did an excellent job of defending the United States, of advancing the United States interest, and speaking for the United States.
Well, Sedney, on a slightly lighter note, I don't think unthinking or flippant is entirely derogatory. But anyway, I take your point. Thank you so much, Dave. Sedney, Dr. Rifaat Hussain, Ali Sultan, Ambassador Zamir Akram. This is all we have for today and for this week. From Indus Special, I shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.